Hello everyone, in this video I want to talk a little bit about settings in iOS and macOS and creating permanent settings in your app. In other words, settings that persist throughout different launches of your app and that users can change. Now, this in principle, Apple has a very simple API for doing this that is actually nearly identical between both their implementations, called NS user defaults, and it's just a key value store where you can say, okay, I want to store a certain value for this key, and then when I want to get that setting back, I query for that key essentially, and it gives me the value back. That sounds very simple, and in some iOS apps it can literally be that simple, because you have a settings app on your iPhone that apps can interact with, and that just trigger those NS user defaults and puts a user interface based on them, and you're triggering them directly. But in macOS we don't really have a user interface like that, so you have to manage the user interface, manage kind of the state and the setting and the getting of those properties. So as we'll see in a minute, it gets a bit more complicated than just having to although interacting with the store directly is simple, we have to manage the state of our settings. So not only do we have to set and get them, but we also need to set and get them in multiple places where they're relevant at the time that they're relevant, but also when we're setting them. For example, if a user is going to opens a preferences panel to set yes or no on a certain value, the system needs to know what value it already is, so the user can see what they're actually changing. So therefore we need access to those that are state into two different places. So that's what we're going to look at how to do today. I'm going to do it on macOS because it's a little more complicated there, and just give you a bit of a sense of kind of a real world app. So with that said, let's dive into the demo. I've got quite a simple application set up here where I can just set different colours, and I can change whether the changing between colours is animated or basic. So you just saw animated and there's basic, but critically you notice that when I started the application, it started with this brown colour one, started on animated. Well, if I change this initial colour value to some green, for example, and then I close out of that, press OK, and I, for example, say that animation is disabled by default rather than enabled, and just close out of the app and relaunch it. When I get my new document, it reloads and sets those values. So I've got green here to start off with, and the setting in new colours doesn't animate. So let's look at how to implement both these simple settings, and say underneath all we're doing is setting and getting some values, but it's a little more complicated than that. So at this core, what do we need to do? Well, this is the public API for that colour view, and you notice both our settings are public for that colour view, whether animation is enabled and what the fill of the drawing colour is. Now we want to be able to manipulate that colour in our application, obviously, but we also want to maintain it in settings. So I've got a settings preferences controller here, which is responsible for that settings window we saw. And there's simple stuff here, like, for example, if we change when the user changes the animation toggle, we see if animation is already enabled, and then if it's not, we set this var on the controller itself to be true or false, and then that means that when the user then presses OK, we can run this grab and save defaults function, which checks if the animation default we currently have set is the same as the default in the settings repository, and if it's not, then it gets that value and sets it to what the current value of that property is for key, and there's this weird preference keys dot animation startup setting name. Well, that's just a string, and that's what we do in larger apps. We set constants for strings so that anywhere in our app we can just refer to them rather than having to type out the specific string so that it's typed. So if we go into our items there, we can see we've just got a struct with all our preference keys in it, and that maps to this animation setting name. So we've seen where we set the value, and we check if it's not the same before we set it, and we also set the color to some color that we generate, and set that to a value of main color setting name. But what happens with that? Well, NS user defaults only is meant to store small data property list items, and NS color isn't a property list item, but like we saw in the core data demo, it does convert to an archive. So that's what we're using here. We're saying convert the current value of the picker at the time we save to an archive, and then we're gonna store the archive version. We're gonna set the NS user default of main color setting name to be that name. Now, if we scroll up a little bit, we see this class of global settings. What's that all about? Well, this just has some static vars on it that are constants effectively, that we can use globally in anywhere in our application, because we notice that when we set the when our view loads, we figure out which radio button to select by saying, is this animated by default var equal to true? Well, that animated by default bar is based on getting the global settings animated by default option. And what does that do? Well, it just returns the string from the NS user defaults. But what that means is we can also use it in our view itself, so we can show the correct value in the preferences panel, which is this one, but we can also show the correct value to the user, which is managed by our main view controller here. So when our view loads, one of the things we do is check that global settings object, which, say, if we'd set that in our preferences controller, we'll now access to that. So we check that global settings object and see if that animated by default option. And what that means is equals true. So if it equals true, we're gonna turn the animation control on, and if it's not true, we're gonna turn it off. So it's giving us this ability to have access to it in multiple controllers. Also in the view, obviously that's where we set this default color. So you can see we have a var here, for example, for animation enabled, which is just equal to whatever the current value is of that global settings we took. And what does that global settings thing do again? Well, it just wherever we are in the app, it just gets a ball for that key string that we set. So having these static vars for managing settings is really useful. In terms of our what color we're using, we know that we have a public API for setting the color because it's a public var, so we can. But what we're saying is, by default, in other words, when this view first loads, the drawing color is going to be equal to whatever we get from unarchiving the default color, and we showed how to get the color to put it in a setting, but to get it out of the setting, we if we go back to our preferences controller, we can see that what we do is encapsulate that logic, so we get the value out of the box just as a generic value, because we can't store colors in NSUser defaults. We have to store them as raw data, so we get out the generic value and then we type it as a color and return it for whoever's asking for it. So when we ask for it here in the view, we get a value of it gives us back a value of NS color, because that's what we're telling it here that we're going to give back an NS color. So that was just well, not a very simple, but kind of a real world example of how you might use NS defaults and coordinate it in terms of real world application. Often you need some sort of singleton object that can share state between different parts of your applications, so that it can monitor the setting itself and also keep the whatever preferences maintenance UI you have informed about what the current settings are. So anyway guys, thank you for watching this video. I hope it was helpful, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.